Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of James Madison, and the focus is Mr. Madison's War. The year is 1809. Madison is now the fourth president of the United States. He's been a politician for more than 30 years, but in all those years, this is the first time he's actually in an executive role. The buck stops with him. And he's got some challenges on his hands right from the get-go, mainly dealing with foreign policy. Britain and France have been at war with each other again for a number of years, both sides taking it out on American shipping, and the United States is still struggling to figure out what to do about this. Under Thomas Jefferson's administration as Secretary of State, James Madison was against going to war. They tried economic policies, an embargo that unfortunately really didn't work. In fact, it was basically a disaster for the Americans. But Madison was particularly against this concept of going to war. He had said a decade earlier that in spite of all the claims and examples of patriotism, which ought by no means to be undervalued, the testimony of all ages forces us to admit that war is among the most dangerous of all enemies to liberty, and that the executive is the most favored by it of all the branches of power. He was going to be cautious just like Jefferson was, so he doubled down on economic policies. He tried to modify things to make something better for his citizens with something called the Non-Intercourse Act, which narrowed the embargo just to Britain and France. Didn't do any good. They followed that up with something called Macon's Bill Number 2. This was a creative idea. They basically told Britain and France, if you'll stop attacking our ships, we'll open up trade with you and we'll keep the embargo going with your enemy. That didn't work either. There was also another new dynamic in play as the United States continued to add states, particularly in the West. States like Tennessee and Kentucky had come into the Union, and they were clamoring for war, more of this push to actually pick up weapons and take to war against either Britain or France, in particular the British. That's what the war hawks from these Western states had in their mind, and their leader, Henry Clay, who was a freshman congressman who was elevated to Speaker of the House in his freshman year, and they had set their sights on Canada. They thought if the British were wrapped up in these wars against Napoleon and France and Europe, they couldn't send enough soldiers to North America, and Canada was there to be taken. So this was an opportunity to really expand a lot more land for the United States. The war hawks were pushing and pushing. Well, based on the pure numbers, war was actually sort of a foolish notion if you think about it. The American Army had about 4,000 soldiers. The American Navy had about 4,000 sailors. The British Navy alone had 140,000 sailors. The British had 500 warships in their arsenal. The United States had 5 frigates, 3 sloops, 7 brigs, and 62 coastal gunboats, the latter of which really had no factor, couldn't do anything practically in a matter of war. So a complete imbalance when it comes to sort of the numbers. But nothing was working, and there was an ultimate accounting that Madison took in the summer of 1812. What has been the damage? And it was nearly 1,000 ships of American sailing ships had been confiscated or seized, about 400 almost by the British, over 500 by the French. And so Madison had a question at hand that he had to finally answer. Would he ask for a declaration of war since the economic plan wasn't working? And if so, against whom? Well, in June of 1812, Madison relented. He called for a declaration of war against the British. He said about the British that they were carrying on a war against the lawful commerce of a friend, that she may better carry on a commerce with an enemy. Congress needed to decide whether the Americans would continue passive under these progressive usurpations or begin to respond in kind. Madison was ready to respond in kind. Why the British and not the French? Well, Madison believed impressment, this practice that the British had long-standing where they would board American ships and effectively kidnap American citizens and force them to become parts of the British Navy. This was anathema to all Americans, and it was something policy-wise Madison was going to try to stop, even if he had to go to war to do it. The other was that the British had friends with the Indians in the American Northwest Territory, and they were encouraging those Indians to attack American settlers. This was another reason why Madison chose Britain to have his declaration of war. Now, the House of Representatives approved the declaration of war almost immediately. The Senate took a little longer, and the vote was actually close. This was not an all-in effort where everyone was behind the president to go to war, but they got the vote, and for the first time in American history, a U.S. president, commander-in-chief, would be in that role with a foreign war, and it's James Madison in that seat. Was the war necessary? Well, that's debatable. In one sense, it was already a war, a one-sided war that the British, in a way the French, but the British were certainly already in place. But another thing is, after so many months and years of this, the honor of the Americans were essentially at stake. And you can almost think of the War of 1812 as akin to a duel, something that was still common in the United States to resolve questions of honor on the dueling ground. Well, this was the same kind of thing. The Americans had to stand up for themselves no matter the odds. They felt their honor was at stake as individuals, as states, and as a country. And so they decided to have an international duel against Britain with armies and navies on the battlefield. Now, the battles in the War of 1812 were actually kind of few and far between, and we'll cover more of those in future episodes in the lives of William Henry Harrison and Andrew Jackson. We'll just touch on a couple here. The first is Canada. Yes, the Americans went after Canada, but it was sort of an aborted attempt initially where the regular army and the militia were uncoordinated, didn't go well, but eventually they actually did get into Canada and attacked York, which was the capital of Upper Canada. And they captured the city, and then they went a little too far. They burned the Parliament buildings. There was a bunch of looting. This was something the British were not going to forget. And the British situation changed pretty shortly thereafter. In March of 1814, they defeated Napoleon. France was defeated in Europe, which meant Britain now had a whole bunch of sailors, ships, and soldiers that they could send to North America to take on the Americans. So the tenor was definitely changing. And the British had revenge on their mind. Why? Because of what happened in York. So they set their sights on the American capital, Washington, D.C. Now, this was something that was actually lightly guarded by the Americans. Madison's Secretary of War, John Armstrong, and the commander on the ground in the area, Brigadier General William Winder, they didn't think that the capital was a military target. It didn't have any military value, so it was lightly defended. Well, this was miscalculation because the British were set out for revenge for York. When they were finally spotted in and around Washington, the Americans had to scramble, and they set up a defensive line at Bladensburg, Maryland, and President Madison rode out to actually watch the action. And he saw his Americans stand for like one volley. And then the Americans were simply overrun. And Madison had to skedaddle back to the Capitol. He went to the executive mansion, got whatever papers he could, and then he headed across the Potomac River into Virginia, basically running for his life. Well, the British entered Washington, D.C., but they didn't just enter. They took their revenge. They burned the Capitol. They burned the Capitol building. They burned the executive mansion. Well, James Madison, the President of the United States, was hightailing it out of there. It was the low point of Madison's presidency, the low point of the war, and Madison had to figure out again, what do they do next? In the meantime, though, he had other problems. There was dissent really throughout the war. Again, this was not a unanimous undertaking by the United States. In particular, there were people in the northeastern part of the country, former Federalists who were going to be opposed to Madison in sort of anyway, who were staunchly opposed to the war. And Madison was certainly bothered by this. He made the comment in a letter to Wilson Nicholas that you are not mistaken in viewing the conduct of the eastern states as the source of our greatest difficulties in carrying on the war, as it certainly is the greatest, if not the sole inducement with the enemy to persevere in it. To Madison's credit, he didn't do anything about this. Even when these folks gathered in convention in Hartford, Connecticut to propose some constitutional amendments, they wanted to make it harder to impose economic sanctions, make it harder to declare war. So there was a lot of dissent and opposition going on in the Northeast, but Madison did nothing to suppress it. He stood by the Constitution. He stood by the Bill of Rights. There would be no sedition law. There would be no arrests. He protected the civil liberties, even of those in opposition, which is a real credit and has not always been the case in times of American security issues and wars. The mayor of Washington, D.C., James Blake, offered this line of gratitude to Madison for sticking with this policy. According to Blake, power and national glory, sir, have often been acquired by the sword, but rarely without the sacrifice of civil or political liberty. We cannot resist offering you our own as well as a nation's thanks for the energy with which you have directed it to its proper objects without infringing a political, civil, or religious right. This was a big deal, and Madison deserves a lot of credit for it. Now, in the meantime, Madison was already thinking peace. He put together an all-star cast of peace negotiators that he sent to Europe. They gathered in Belgium, and it was led by a chairman, John Quincy Adams, the son of the former president. Henry Clay was part of the group, Albert Gallatin, the Secretary of the Treasury, and a couple of others. And by the time the British finally came together, they decided to negotiate, and once again, impressment was the key object. Britain would not relent on this topic. There was no ifs, ands, or buts about it, and it was still the policy of the United States to keep the war going until that came off the table. Well, the President, Madison, started to change his mind because they realized the situation was different. Since the war with France was over, Britain wasn't fighting in Europe anymore. It didn't need to impress Americans into service in its own navy. And so Madison asked his cabinet the question of whether a treaty of peace silent on the subject of impressment be authorized. And the cabinet agreed yes. They actually thought even if impressment was still sort of on the books as British policy, they weren't going to use it anymore. So why keep fighting this war over something that was unlikely to be used? And once this was in place, the negotiations actually went rather quickly. What had ended up happening? They basically decided on a draw to go with the status quo antebellum, the status quo prior to the war. There would be no indemnity, there would be no land swaps. Basically, you go back to the way things were. And that's in essence what was in the Treaty of Ghent in Belgium that they signed December 24th, 1814. Now, it took about a month for the news of the treaty to come back to the United States, so the fighting continued, and there was one more battle, and boy, was it a big deal for the Americans. Major General Andrew Jackson put his defensive line in place a few miles south of New Orleans, a critical place for the Americans, and not only did they hold their line, they obliterated the British in the process. So both of these events became known across the United States about the same time in early of 1815. Jackson's big victory at New Orleans and the peace treaty. Everyone was really excited. The peace treaty was authorized almost immediately. The war was over. The war was essentially a draw, but the Americans felt victorious. Why? Well, first of all, their honor. They had fulfilled this international duel, standing up to the British, not just for the first time, but the second time in a couple of decades, the mightiest army and navy in the world, and they had at least not lost in this latest effort, and by not losing, they felt like it was a victory. In fact, Albert Gallatin, one of those peace negotiators, put it this way: the character of America stands now as high as ever on the European continent and higher than it ever did in Great Britain. The war has renewed and reinstated the national feelings and character which the Revolution had given and which were daily lessened. The people now have more general objects of attachment with which their pride and political opinions are connected. This was the general consensus in the United States after what was technically a draw, but felt like a victory. So Mr. Madison's War, it actually ended up boosting American standing abroad, boosting pride at home, and that's how he ended the War of 1812. And that is James Madison and Mr. Madison's War from the life of James Madison. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher. This is Presidential Chronicles.